Hi, my name is Dr. Anika Prather, and I'm a professor in the classics department at Howard University, where I teach a humanities one course that focuses on Blacks and classical studies. And I just really enjoy this class. And I'm looking forward to sharing what my journey was to getting to that place. I'm also the founder of the Living Water School, which is a very unique school, very small, which combines the philosophies of classical education with democratic schooling, where children learn how to learn and live in a free society. Um, my topic today is called Living in the Constellation of Canon, the lived experiences of African American students reading classic literature. Now, this presentation is based on my dissertation. Um, I earned my PhD in curriculum and instruction in the College of Education at the University of Maryland of College Park. And I did something really bold and very scary. And I chose not to research more traditional approaches to education, but instead wanted to look at the role the study of classics has played historically in the Black community. And I also wanted to show how my implementing classical education, specifically reading classics and great books with Black students, what that looked like. And I used a methodology called Phenomenology, which allows me to really focus in on the narrative behind my students' experiences. Um, my study covered the lives and experiences of 6 of my former students. They were adults when I did the study, but we did some reflection of their time with me in high school before they became adult. And we really were able to capture some of the themes and some of the things that began to happen to them as they moved through the literature with me. This presentation is just going to give you a synopsis of that. The book, Living in the Constellation of the Canon, I have now self-published this dissertation. You can buy it on Amazon. Just look for Dr. Anika Prather, Living in the Constellation of the Canon. So let's get started so I can tell you a little bit about this. Living in the Constellation of the Canon. Before I begin, let me describe some terms. What are classics? What are great books? What is classical education? And what is liberal arts education? I'm gonna try to do this quickly. Classics is the study of anything to do, any of the literature, the art, the culture that is connected to ancient Greece and Rome and all of the other cultures that intersect there in that narrative. That is classics. Great books includes classics, but it's a branching out. It includes the books, the art, the literature, the creations of all those who reference classics in their works, are inspired by classics, and those are presented. And those tend to go from that point all the way up to present day. That great books list is constantly being revised, and it still needs some revision because I need to add a little more color to the list, but those are great books. Classical education combines classics and great books, the study of logic, the study of rhetoric, learning Latin, learning Greek, and this classics and great books are put in a K-12 curriculum. If you're from the United States, we go from kindergarten, which is usually age 5, all the way up to 12th grade, which ends around 18 years old, and then they off to college. And classical education is a philosophy that spans those grades, K through 12, where students are learning classically from kindergarten all the way up through 12th grade. And the liberal arts education is almost the same as classical education, but if there's a little more freedom to it. Classical education has more of a formula it follows, where students grow through certain stages of development as they work through the study of classics and great books and other courses as well. Liberal arts education is more classically inspired, but it just seems to be a lot more inclusive, not so focused on just the Western tradition, but it seems to be open to saying We honor the great Western tradition, but we recognize there are other voices that are inspired by the Western tradition that we want to incorporate. And so it's a lot more freeing. And so that's my understanding of the two, but it involves a lot of Socratic, both classical education and liberal arts involves Socratic seminars where you're reading a text and then discussing that text, making connections with it, and so on. The chapters of my study are The Journey to My Star, and this is where I share what caused me to turn to this phenomenon. My dream was to be a famous educational theater star. I was going to write plays, direct plays used to educate our young people in school and out of school. But at the same time I was on that path, I happened to start teaching great books and classics class at a very small classical school. And I thought it was just going to be a part-time thing, and it turned out to really consume my every thought. And then once I discovered that there is an actual tradition of studying classics in Black history, I gave up my dream to be a famous educational theater star to focus on the role classics have played in the history of Black people and looking at how when people of color, children, students of color read classics, what happens to them. The second chapter is, the second part is inviting others to the conversation. These others are those who aren't usually added to this discussion. My people, the African American people specifically. And I know there are others, but I'm here to speak on behalf of the African American people. These are people like Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Anna Julia Cooper, Huey P. Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther, Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, Toni Morrison. So many influential Black people, Angela Davis, have connected to classics and great books, and W.E.B. Du Bois, they have had something to say about the power of the classics in their life and in the lives of Black people as we were coming out of slavery. And so that chapter really breaks down the history of classics in the Black community, all the way up until desegregation of schools, which is where it seemed to kind of fizzle out. The next part is connections. What connections to my life, to my students' lives were made? The next section 4 is the light of freedom through liberal education. I revisit the history of classics in the lives of the African American people, and I really begin to hone in on the specifics of how reading these texts seem to be connected to those who fought for the freedom of the African American people. Then I go into a chapter where I talk about why I use phenomenology and why I feel phenomenology allowed me to get closer to this topic, closer to the hearts of my students, closer to looking at what is happening when someone who feels oppressed reads these texts. Chapter 6, I take a look at the study. Part of that was us going away on a retreat for a long weekend on Martin Luther King's birthday weekend, and we discussed the experience. We recorded all of these discussions. It was hours and hours of recording. And I created a transcript of these discussions. Also, out of that time away, a play was created called The Table, where we dramatized what it was like being in my class. The students did monologues expressing how these texts were affecting them during the time they were in my class. And those were performed at St. John's College and at the University of Maryland. And then I do a textual analysis where I took the transcripts of all of those things that we discussed over that weekend, and I create patterns and themes to show this is what's happening. So as I expressed earlier, I went from being a performing arts teacher to being a classics and great books teacher. I talk about my first students. I remember there were 6 students. This is what made me go from wanting to change the world through theater for children. I was teaching this classics course, and I had 6 African American male students, all in high school, all from different types of backgrounds, but specifically there was one student who had a very difficult background. I don't want to put his personal business out to the public, but it was a real challenging situation. And through reading classics, he began to change. And it was really exciting to see this evolution take place and to hear him discuss with me how reading the literature was changing his thinking and his perspective on life. Um, and so I continue to talk about my journey to classical education. And then as I began to really get involved with teaching this first set of students, and then I continued to teach it for quite a few years at this school, I became so passionate about it. I felt like I wanted to study great books and classics more. So I found out about St. John's College, and that's where I met Aristotle, who still is my favorite philosopher. And from there, I guess I became a classicist at this point because I began to really get into reading and writing about and researching classic texts and really taking a really close look at how reading classic texts um, affect people when they read it, specifically African American people. Um, Let me talk a little bit about the others I invited to the conversation. There are so many more than these, but let me talk to you about a few. Um, W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, he's at the top of this list because right when I was going through this journey, there was always the question, why do you want to study these texts written by a bunch of dead white men? And I really did not have a lot of evidence that these books were relevant to us besides the transformation I was seeing in my students. And so one day I just happened to be reading Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. And I was reading a specific essay called Of the Training of Black Men. And I'm trying to be careful to articulate some of these sources. So if you're watching this, I hope that you may want to read them yourself. And in that text, he really explains why classical education is so important for the African American community. As a matter of fact, the Souls of Black Folk is really a real treatise on the importance and relevance of classical education to the African American community. Then but let me go back to Du Bois a little bit because I really want to just give you a taste of how this essay of the training of Black men just has this one section that really struck me and really set me on my journey. And he says, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. And we know Shakespeare is a great book, not a classic. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle, there you go, and Aurelius, and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension. So wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Is this the life you grudge us, O knightly America? Is this the life you long to change into the dull red hideousness of Georgia? That text, when it talks about dwelling above the veil, I saw that happening, especially with that student with the challenging background. As he began to read and discuss these classic texts, I saw a new perspective. A veil was lifted for him. And then right along that vein, Anna Julia Cooper, who was around the same time as Du Bois, she was an educator, the first Black woman principal in DC, and she only taught classically to Black students, and her students went on to some of the top colleges in the nation and to just do amazing things. They themselves became school founders as well. Frederick Douglass, spent a lot of time studying classics while he was enslaved. He was able to get his hands on a text called the Columbian Orator, where he would study the works of Cato and Cicero. And he would read these texts to learn the best way to articulate why slavery should be ended. Marva Collins is more contemporary. She passed away not too long ago, but she opened a classical school in the inner cities of Chicago. And used Socratic dialogue a lot in her classroom. Martin Luther King, if you read Letters from a Birmingham Jail, and a lot of his writings, he cites classics and great books quite a bit, which undergirds a lot of his philosophy. As a matter of fact, his autobiography says the classics were often used to help him shape his philosophy for his work in civil rights. Huey P. Newton, Before he became the co-founder of the Black Panther, he was illiterate until he was 18, and he taught himself to read by reading Plato's Republic. And he says after reading the narrative of the cave, the allegory of the cave, he decided he wanted to free Black people. And I love that image. Phyllis Wheatley was another one. She was brought from, I believe, it was either Senegal or Sierra Leone. She was brought into America as a kidnapped slave girl, about 10 years old. She was bought by a man by the name of John Wheatley. They educated her classically, and she went on to become the first published Black author. And she wrote beautiful poetry, all rooted in the study of classics. I could go on and on about this, but again, classics has played such an integral part in the story of the African American people. So what are the connections that I made? Well, I recognize that when we say things like classics or great books, in my mind, when I read them and when I think about the effect they had on my students, I don't see them as I'm saying this is some elite text or these books are better than somebody else's. But it's just that they're all encompassing. They're great, meaning expansive. They open their arms and embrace all of us. They're classic because they can stand the test of time, and they're classic because no matter the color of your skin, they can relate to you. No matter your background, if you are a young man, like I've had students where parents were on drugs, they were about to lose their homes, they were poor, they were destitute. I've had students who were upper middle class, and all of them had the same response to these texts. Life changing. And I think it's because we join in that great conversation. We talk to Aristotle and Socrates and Sophocles, and we engage in this discussion, even though they were centuries and centuries and centuries ago. We can, as one of my students said, they're going through the same thing we're going through. And so and I've shared with you the history between classics, great books, and the African American people, and how my people have really connected a great deal to classics. And they have also engaged in that great conversation where they can be inserted into the list of great books of people who reference classics. I just feel like classics is very foundational to all of us. They get us closer to the very beginnings of mankind. They organize the story of where we all began, and we can understand the rise and fall of human civilizations and the struggle of humanity. It's the human story. And so I am able, as a Black woman, I'm able to connect my story to the story of the West, which is it really even the story of the West? If you read classics, if you're reading Herodotus, you hear about the Ethiopians. You hear about all the diverse people that intersect there. The classical artists, classical authors don't hide the diverse voices that tell the human story. It's us who are affected by race, who struggle to highlight all of the people who have connected to this body of work. So I feel like it's kind of my duty, my mission to reconstruct the African American story with classics and with great books to show how that it's been left out. Maybe we've left it out because we've been so hurt by those who oppressed us. But I want us to be encouraged to bring it back in so we can get more of the fullness of our story, because it's such an important part of the narrative of our life. And then I said the light of freedom through liberal arts education. Liberal arts education versus classical education. I shared with you at the beginning, where I am becoming more of a liberal arts person. I'm definitely classically inspired, but as I look more and more at the role that reading classics has played in African American people, I find them more than just classical. They liberate us. I look at how they liberated Frederick Douglass as he read the Columbian Orator. I look at how Phyllis Wheatley, in some of her poems, she talks about her sadness of being separated from her family, but she finds a refuge in classics. And in learning the language of those who enslaved us, we're able to engage in a common language. And that's also another part of my passion, is how can classics be used as a bridge? Whether we like it or not, We've all found ourselves reading a classic text. It is something that we all have in common. And so we learn that language of those who maybe have oppressed us, not as a way to assimilate or to feel like we're subservient, but that we can connect and maybe heal. I also to use phenomenology, which gets me closer to this amazing story of the role of classics in the lives of Black people. I was really inspired by Martin Heidegger, who says to think is to confine yourself to a single thought that one day stands still like a star in the world sky. When I saw that student from the troubled background get connected to classic texts, I could not get it out of my mind. Martin Heidegger gave me the spirit of phenomenology, that spirit of wonder. His interest in Aristotle was amazing to me because Aristotle, I think, is the king of how to wonder. And so that allowing myself the freedom to wonder about what I'm seeing with this. Then Hans Georg Gadamer, he brings the principles of conversation and questioning. That weekend my students and I went away, it was a time where I was just asking them questions and we were talking and I was able to pull out these narratives of what was happening internally as we read the text. And then Max Van Manen gave me principles on how to write it all up into this book, Living in the Constellation of the Canon, where I can be able to tell my story. And we did the play. The characters of the play, the students and I, that weekend, we created a play that we performed to kind of give people a visual of what it was like to be in my classics course. They renamed themselves Zora after Zora Neale Hurston, Arthur Scott, Zeke, Sophia, and Ray Charles. They all made up their names. And then the whole play is set around the table. And there are 4 scenes of the play which reveal the 4 themes of my study. As I asked them questions, I recognized there was a time where the light was flickering, where they were like, I don't know if I want to read these. These are not relevant to me. But wait a minute, this text I'm kind of connecting with. So there's this flicker of interest. Then when the flame catches, that moment, like my student who had the troubled past and life, he started out very resistant, but then there was a flicker. And then there was something that made him say, aha, there was an aha moment. That light was shining bright. And then they began to dwell in this presence. Like Du Bois says, I am dancing with them in gilded halls. And they begin to just be in this space of reading and enjoying classics and allowing it to transform them. And then the lived experience shining into the present. They are adults, even though they're talking about when they were young teens, they're adult. And they were able to articulate ways that experience affected their current life. For example, I had a student who was, I think, like a sophomore in college, and he was in engineering. And he talked about reading books like books from Aristotle taught him how to really read through a difficult text, just that skill. And he talked about how in his classes, his classmates were surprised that he was able to just pick up the textbook and understand it. And he began to win awards within his engineering department. And he said he was able to attribute it to the constant reading through and engagement with these classic texts. And so the plot of the play is a group of African American students within a high school literature class engage in dialogue around classics, great books, and African American literature. Students, along with their teacher, connect the text of their lives, both as individuals and as African Americans. At the end of my study, after I analyzed all of the texts and created those themes, there are things I began to think about. I began to wonder about identity. How do we name ourselves? How do we see ourselves when we think about this history of connecting the Black narrative with the classics? Who can really come to these books? How can we focus more on humanness as much as we do on race? Everything seems to be so colored by race, but what about our humanity? I began to wonder about teaching. How does reading classics with my students affect my teaching? What am I giving? I feel like I'm giving freedom to my students. I am developing their critical thinking. The classics and great books are a tool for teaching students. I really am a firm believer because even now I'm still using classics with children of color, but now I'm teaching Hispanic students. And I have been able to teach students who came to me illiterate, unable to speak English, and just taking them step by step through reading classics and a classically inspired curriculum, I've gotten them to a much better place as a result. So it really is a tool for educating students. Wondering about my future in classical education. My desire is to bring more of us, more diverse faces and voices around these texts. It is my desire to show how these texts are culturally relevant to everyone. You can really go through history and find out different people who have somehow seen something transformative in these texts. Not only that, if you read closely, you can see diverse faces in the texts, okay? And I would love to create a space, a center around diverse voices having the great conversation, not just me with people who don't, with in a white group discussing the text, but a mixture of Black and brown and white and tan and cream, all types of people, no matter your background, gathered around these texts, enjoying the human story and building bridges to each other. That is my presentation on living in the constellation of the canon. Thank you.